one thing I will say is a country in which the crimes of communism and concern for the victims of communism are very much part of the national agenda is the country in which we're standing at the moment. For the last year, as a result of the anniversary of 56, there has been a year of people remembering what happened under communism and the victims, its victims, and what must be done to change things. In fact, those of you who found yourself, as Melissa and I did by accident on Saturday, coming through the square outside the Basilica, we found ourselves witnessing a sonne lumiere of extraordinary power, I thought, about 56 and the victims and the crimes. Well worth, I don't know if it's available on the internet, but I hope it is, and we should all try to see it. Now, for the last year, there's been a special national committee appointed by the government to oversee the remembrance of the victims of communism and of the period of totalitarianism. And Áron Mathé has been its vice chairman. He has written a long list of books on this very topic, which I'm going to, I won't read out, but I will ask you to look at in the program you have. And I think we're very fortunate now to be able to ask him to give a talk on the situation here. Thank you.
Dear Professor Sullivan, dear ladies and gentlemen, I was informed that the title of this panel is The Unquiet Graves. I think it's very appropriate and strong. Regarding that we are currently living the 100th anniversary of the 1917 Bolshevik coup, it might be catchy to say that the balance of communism so far, 100 years, 100 million dead. However, I would not like to speak about the millions who had lost their lives in the period when the communists started to rule. I would not like to speak in detail about those who had deliberately been starved to death along the Volga, on the steppes of Kazakhstan, or during the course of the Ukrainian Holodomor. It would also take long to mention the at least 1 million Soviet citizens who were shot to death during the Great Terror. I also feel it would exceed the limits of the current conversation if we discussed the tens of millions, yes, tens of millions, who died during the Great Leap Forward in China. In this case, it would also be difficult to ignore the lives lost in the North Korean re-education camps, in fact, concentration camps, or the victims of the Cambodian death fields would also be considered part of this, accounting for a quarter of the country's population. If we wanted to make an itemized list with the historical backgrounds, the hundreds of thousands or even millions who died in the socialist-like regimes of Africa should also not be ignored. Paul Johnson simply referred to these countries as kingdoms of Caliban. But we could also mention the victims of the South American communist experiments, as these have been going on up to the present day. Well, dear ladies and gentlemen, this brief specification itself contains elements of a very horrible list, and it was not even complete. I have not said a word about the Central European victims of communism. I have willfully left them to the end, as on one hand, I primarily work with this issue, and on the other hand, one of these conversations partners, Jaap Scholten, also wrote his aforementioned book about this region. Regarding the Central European victims and their graves, I would say it is rather difficult even to estimate the number. Narrowing the issue to the Hungarian victims, the task is even more complex, since, as you also know, the borders of Hungary and the borders of the Hungarian nation are not the same. I just tell you an example. A colleague from Prague a historian from our Czech partner institution, who has dedicated much of his career to researching the Gulag, wanted to record interviews with survivors deported from former Czechoslovakia, and he was stunned by the fact that he needed an interpreter with nearly all the witnesses living in southern Slovakia. These elderly people spoke only Hungarian. Likewise, I was also astonished to learn that the Czech researchers of the Gulag consider Hungarians deported to Soviet captivity from Transcarpathia region, currently a part of Ukraine. So the Czechs count these Hungarians as their own victims, since this region belonged to Czechoslovakia between 1918 and 1938. However, the captives were deported from 1944 on. Returning to the issue of the Hungarian victims, in Hungary especially, but generally in Central Europe, the victims were mainly caused by the activities of the Soviet authorities themselves. In case of Poland, the Baltic states, and Hungary, it basically coincided with some kind of ethnic cleansing as well. In Hungary, the situation was aggravated by the fact that the pre-war establishment was considered fascist by the Comintern. If you are asking how many casualties communism had demanded in Hungary, we should primarily consider the victims of the Soviet occupation and captivities. The deported ones were kept under inhuman circumstances. Most of them were first taken to domestic collective camps within the country, where dysentery and typhus already started taking lives. Several points of collections had become actual death camps. These camps were closed down after the typhoid epidemic broke out. Tens of thousands died there or during the deportation, the transportation to the Soviet Union. At least half of those gathered in Hungary and or taken to the Soviet Union never returned. This could well mean even 400,000 casualties, including POWs as well. Those who returned more or less became stigmatized. They were ordered to be speechless by the representatives of the communist dictatorship. I quote a survivor: "The relatives of the non-returners naturally asked us questions. In the evening, a secret police officer I had known came over to me in civilian clothes and said, 'I don't want to get you in trouble. Don't speak, just remain quiet about everything.' So I remained quiet." Quote ends. The Soviet forces had basically accomplished the work. However, of course, there was plenty of work left for the collaborationists in Hungary. We will never find out how many people were tortured to death in the beating rooms of the András úthatvany, which is now the House of Terror Museum, or how many people were beaten to death or killed some other way in the county police centers. The number of those officially executed after the 1956 revolution is 230, and at least 2,500 died because of combat, including those who were killed in salvos. Before the 1956 revolution, we have information of about 400 official executions. However, this figure is a bit problematic, as some war criminals may also be included. In connection with this, I would like to cite a British historian, Richard Overy. Quote, "How many died resisting in the crossfire between the two systems during the war will never be known with certainty. The difference between resistance here and resistance in Western and Southern Europe is that it failed to overturn either system and was extinguished with a harsh brutality by both the dictatorships. In this sense, there is equivalence in remembering those who struggled against both totalitarian systems as bold forerunners of the eventual movement to liberate the former communist bloc from communist rule. Memory even here can be problematic, since in some cases the earlier insurgents were hardly models of tolerant democratic values." Quote ends. The victims of communism have been suffering up to the present day due to the fact that the communists themselves wished to blacken even their memories. For example, in Hungary, last year, the case of György Donát kicked up dust. There was a plan to erect a small bust of him. György Donát was executed in 1947, and he was accused of conspiracy, of course. His courage, clear logics, and truthfulness had even surprised the communist journalists who were sent to the trial. The problem, however, was that from modern perspective, his anti-Jewish statements during the war meant that there are some problematic questions. This is what the communist propaganda exploited, exaggerated, and distorted, as if he had been an ordinary Nazi, which, of course, he was not. In other cases, however, the task of the communists against their opponents was not so obvious. After the 1956 revolution, in nearly all the cases, they tried to prove the thesis, I quote, "Prostitutes and fascists joined hands with the neither word." In other words, the freedom fighters were also sued by common criminal accusations. These verdicts were in effect until the decade following the transition, nearly till the millennium. As a result, a proportion of the Hungarian intellectuals had a kind of ambivalent feelings toward their own heroes. The legal rehabilitation of the former victims had to be accomplished in political and legal struggles, though no less than 4 nullity acts between 1989 and 2001. Despite all this, there are people even today who believe the lies willfully bequeathed to posterity, which are to be read in the official documents of the state security, of the communist state security and the legal courts. Dear ladies and gentlemen, even though I have spoken about casualty so far, partly because it was suggested by the title, and partly because when we say victims, we first think of the dead, I would like to mention another example as well. So what about those whose lives had been destroyed? Respecting my conversation partners and the audience as well, please allow me just one example. Its name is Baron Daniel Banfi, who used to be the agricultural minister during the war until the German occupation, but he supported anti-Nazi and anti-German efforts, and he was arrested by the Gestapo and then by the Hungarian Nazis. After the war, the Communist Party demanded him to be classified as a war criminal, but somehow he was removed from that list. Afterwards, his merits were acknowledged, but he could not be saved from being deported to a forced residence from his own flat with his family. He was deprived of his remaining wealth and existence as well. Meanwhile, in Transylvania, Romania, proceedings of unclarified outcome were in progress against him in his absence. Due to the harassment, he died soon after. Finally, I would like to close my remarks with a more general conclusion. There is a very important statement in the Black Book of Communism, by Stéphane Courtois, which we must cite when discussing victims. It reads, quote, "Communism had committed countless many crimes, first of all against the human spirit, but also against the universal culture and the national cultures," quote ends. The dictatorship here also bore a systematic campaign against the Hungarian national culture and against the Hungarian national identity as well. So I do believe that the victims of communism will only rest in peace once we retrieve their history, once we restore our national identity, and once the dead can get their worthy place in the national remembrance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mathé, and I'd like to thank all 3 speakers on this very powerful panel for making speeches that kept to the time limits while sparing us nothing in force and drama and the contrast between, on the one hand, the atrocities they describe, and on the other hand, the indifference or even at times the support that intellectuals and governments gave it. We have enough time, I'm happy to say now, for about 5 or 6 questions. The first one is Mr. Roth at the back.
Yes, thank you. I'm just curious. It would seem to me, and setting aside the paranoid fear that they're not finished with us yet, that there are a number of apologists for communism and communists who are still in positions of authority, both here in Eastern Europe and certainly in the West. Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York was an apologist for the Nicaraguan communists in the 80s and was just reelected mayor of New York. And I'm just wondering if that may in fact be part of the reason that we've had trouble putting this to bed, because their apologists are still among us and active and don't wish to be confronted with their perfidy.
Anne-Elizabeth, why don't you start?
I would. Does this work? Can you hear me? Excellent. I would say that you can do this, but you're basically speaking in a vacuum. Nobody's going to sort of prevent you from doing it. Nobody's going to prevent you from publishing a book about it. You will be ridiculed the minute you try to inject this into a political debate, and you will be regularly sort of brushed aside, but it's more the kind, it's done through snobbishness, it's done through the manners of the salon more than it's done through terror. There's no terror of my experience neither in London or in Paris, but oh, she's boring, she's at it again. It's this sort of thing, and you end up pacing yourself because you realize that if you try to sort of be a bit more earnest about such horrors have just been described, then you're going on and you're just being tiresome. So it's almost more efficient that way. Nobody's preventing you from speaking. They're just saying you're terribly boring and they won't listen to you. In terms of political parties, that's in sort of general intellectual life, doing this on television where you definitely have to pace yourself in order to be reinvited, that sort of thing. In terms of parties, if I look at the spectrum in front, the minute you start talking about the crimes of communism, the minute you start saying that communism should be seen on par with Nazism, you will immediately be branded a nouveau réactionnaire. You will be branded as somebody who is beyond the pale, and therefore this is somebody who's all just as people talk about think tanks for liberal think tanks, but we'll say a right-wing think tank when it's a think tank of the opposite persuasion. There will be a different treatment, and that has an effect in how much how much the market will bear, I should say. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yes, I think so. Would either of the other two speakers like to come in on this?
Well, as I said, in Romania there is a big lobby group for to keep memorials and remembrance out of the public space. And what I thought for me is very interesting. I especially in the United States, it happened to me that a few times when I was giving a talk, there is clearly a Securitate man to just disturb my talk. It happened a few times. And when I was making a documentary in Romania, we were clearly followed and also visibly. Sometimes when we went to interview somebody, at every entrance there was a man in the same tracksuit waiting for us. So clearly also that we knew that we were kept an eye on us. So I think this is very much alive. And well, I don't know how it is in other countries.
May I have a word? Here's another one. Maybe it's more simple. So in Hungary, as I mentioned, it was really a political, legal, and I would say academic struggle, dogfights really, till the acknowledgement of crimes of communism. And why? Because there was a very huge network of post-communist intellectuals and politicians who fought up to their nails and to hold up the truth. And I think, Professor Sullivan, you wrote in a foreword to Richard Legutko's book that that businessmen and politicians from the West rather wanted to join up forces with the post-communist forces in the former communist bloc countries because, well, it was much more easier, much more convenient, and they were up to open the market.
They were the only people who could go abroad before. Yeah.
If I can just add one thing, I'm not an academic. In French university circles, it is extremely difficult to present work on this in a big way, and it ends up that you've got special institutes that specialize in this, such as the Institut d'Histoire Sociale of Pierre Rigoulot, which has done sterling work on communist terror, and they are absolutely branded as not worthy of academic record. Our universities, like most universities in the West, are heavily slanted to the left.
Can I ask my colleague Noemi Karani, who's recently joined us as director, to come in here?
I don't want to bring this into this discussion, but I have one remark about Jaap Stolten's answer to this question, but that I just saw that museum in Marmarossiga 2 months ago about the victims of communism. And having seen that, and having seen that there's hardly any mention of any Hungarians living in Romania, although there are millions, as we know, I think that the fact that you've been followed by Securitate people has something to do also with the fact, or with the topic of your book, that you wrote about Hungarian aristocracy and not only about the victims of communism. So I think it's, I don't want to bring this into the discussion, this question of minorities in Romania, but I think that's also a factor, because there is this huge museum.
I wonder if I could ask, we have I'm sorry, did you want to respond?
Yeah, well, the people that I interviewed for my book, Hungarian aristocrats, they said always that they were a double enemy of the Romanian state. They were an aristocrat and they were a Hungarian. Yeah.
I know there are a number of Canadians in the audience, and perhaps if one of them would like to tell us about what happened when there was an attempt to establish a Victims of Communism memorial, which I think has in the end succeeded, but the controversy over it was very interesting. I don't feel confident enough to talk about it, confident in the fact. But Kevin, are you, John? Okay.
So I was a member of the Stephen Harper government, which was the conservative government in Canada, which proposed the idea of a monument to victims of communism. And at first, actually, I worked in his office as communication director, and the bureaucracy insisted that the monument be labeled Victims of Fascist Communism, as if there was somehow a difference between the benign, friendly communism and fascist communism. You're right, yeah, you're right. Totalitarian communism. Thank you, Kevin. We should have had the reporter do this. It was much more accurate. The point being was there was an element within even the Canadian government that wanted to split hairs and suggest, well, there was, as I said, there was a friendly face and a not so friendly face, and we could separate the two. Fortunately, Stephen Harper pressed on. Prime Minister Harper pressed on, and in the end appointed enough people to have it properly named as the Victims of Communism, full stop. There was then, the struggle then became more opaque and more bureaucratic. Where would it be located? How large would it be? There was plans for a new justice building, which is the same spot that the Prime Minister thought was appropriate for this site, across from our Supreme Court building, and on it went. Long story short, it is going to go ahead. Unfortunately, Stephen Harper was defeated 2 years ago. The plans will still go ahead, but they're going to be much smaller than anticipated, and I suspect the site has been moved as well. And I'll turn it over to Kevin, who will correct my errors.
Not at all. One interesting side note that John might have forgotten just because it was so ridiculous was that the public debate became, there were those who said that a monument to the victims of communism must be answered also by a monument to the victims of capitalism. And this was the narrative in, I think, all of the national papers, which with the National Post accepted, of course, But the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and all the local papers, the CBC, of course, this was a very popular idea, the idea that it wasn't communism per se, that was the, as John said, it was some version of communism, but also that economic systems were all bad and perhaps capitalism was just as guilty of crushing people and torturing them as communism was, of course, which is, as I say, ridiculous on its face. But that was one of the more absurd ironies.
Okay, thank you both very much. Another question here, John Fund.
Of course, I lament the amnesia and the willful ignorance of the communist legacy. But I think we have to look at one bright spot. Popular culture is starting to satirize communism in ways that it has not done in my lifetime. I'll just give you 4 brief examples in the last year. Have any of you seen the movie Hail Caesar by the Coen brothers? This not only has the villains a communist writer's cell in Hollywood, but it basically says McCarthy was right and they were the villains. They kidnap people. And it's hilarious. They're satirized. Herbert Marcuse appears as their leader in a very muddled way, which was, of course, his lot in life. The German documentary, or the German drama, Deutschland 83, which goes back to the Pershing Missile Crisis of the 1980s. The Stasi is presented in an extremely negative way, almost a cartoonishly evil way, and the centerpiece of the peace movement depicted in that German series is controlled by a Stasi agent at the University of Bonn, leading us, of course, to remember that East Germans were financing the peace movement in the West. The Americans, which is a very popular 6-season show in America about the 2 Soviet sleeper agents in Virginia in the 1980s, the height of the Reagan era, as they gradually become more and more doubtful about the wisdom of communism and whether or not they're doing something that's moral. And that we will find out what happens to them in the last season as the Soviet Union collapses next year. And lastly, Comrade Detective. This is shown on Romanian television this last year. It was done by liberals, yes, but it is a wickedly funny satire of communism. It's a drama, a crime drama of 2 buddy detectives on the Bucharest PD trying to fight for Marxist-Leninism against Western smugglers. It's a 6-season episode. It's been shown on Amazon in the United States. It was a big hit on Romanian television. I believe we're just starting after 2 generations to see people who don't remember communism start to make fun of it. And as you know, once you satirize something, rather than just attack it, you're making progress.
Yes. I think also one might... Thank you, John. You might add to that one of the best films made in the last 40 or 50 years, The Lives of Others. Not a satire, but a very powerful moral picture of the evil of communism and how one human soul breaks free of it, really. I also, however, have to quote a marvelous line of the late George Jonas, a wonderful Hungarian-Canadian writer, who, reviewing the film Sunshine, said, "As always, in films of this character, the fascist thugs are simply thugs, but the communist thugs are figures of intriguing moral complexity." So, I think we have time for one more question. Oh, yes, indeed, Nicholas.
Yeah, just following on from your very amusing satires, Goodbye Lenin was one of the most famous ones, which really, The Lives of Others was more of a drama, actually, and a tragedy, whereas Goodbye Lenin was a very, very funny way of depicting somebody who really deeply believed in communism, and then overnight, because she was laid up in bed, the big propaganda sign outside her window changed to a Coca-Cola sign, so panic set in. Really, this is for Marie Elizabeth, and about the extraordinary depths to which French intellectuals were prepared to sink in their support of communism. Tony Judd, the late, rather great historian, a social democrat, of course, himself, pointed out that from all the surveys that they could do, that communism amongst these intellectuals was most popular when most slaughter was occurring. And this is an interesting, which you might want to comment on, a very interesting psychological thing. The love, George Orwell addressed this, the love of the strong man to feel that it was being dished out to the enemies, and people like Sartre actually, who of course even in 1968, the Prague Spring didn't deter him, were even more enthusiastic when they thought that the enemies of communism were being slain. That's one thing, and the degree of complicity of the West has not really been fully explored, I think, in these discussions, interesting and brilliant though they were. I translated a book about German history since the Second World War, and it taught me something which I did not know, which was that Chancellor Kohl's Germany was financing up to the 11th, even the 12th hour East Germany with enormous subventions from West Germany. These are the kind of things, and somebody has also mentioned how it was convenient for the West to settle down in a kind of mindset that we must live with them. One last point. I'm sure that Professor Price-Jones does not probably like to be quoted and asked for the copyright, but he has described the mentality of the fellow traveller, what we call the fellow traveller, better than anyone else. And I'm just going to read his brief description of it because it tells us something, I think, very profound about him. I'm going to ask my wife to hold the... A fellow traveller is one who commits to a cause, preferably foreign, and necessarily hostile to the interests of his own country. He, or as often she, believes that the selected cause is promoting the virtues of peace, love, brotherhood, in contrast to the vices of the home country, its government, its injustices, racism, imperialism, or whatever. In most of the world, a dissenting attitude of that kind puts the individual's liberty and life at risk. In the West, the fellow traveller is free to praise what ought to be blamed and blame what ought to be praised, and be rewarded for this with money and reputation by means of false equivalence, double standards, and the assertion that whatever they are guilty of, we were far worse. Anyone can become a celebrity fellow traveller.
I didn't hear. Who is this by? Oh. I don't think there was much to answer to this. I'd like to make one or two points. There has been a constant tension between those former, I won't say fellow travelers, but people who were convinced of the idealism of various doctrines, especially communism, and when they fall down from that, and the best example is, of course, George Orwell coming back, fighting in Catalonia, enlisting entirely by chance with the anarchists, fighting on the Aragon front, and having finally to flee, not so much the Republican army, but the political commissars of the Bolsheviks who were purging the anarchists from the ranks defending the Republic. So he then gets back to London. He had been commissioned by Victor Gollancz to write a book about the Spanish War. The book was supposed to be the left book of the month, published by Gollancz. And Gollancz, reading the book, said, "No, I can't possibly publish that." And Orwell said, "This is, I was there." "No, you can't." So he gave it to another publisher, and that Orwell himself has written that this dated the moment when his eyes opened and he realized what it was, what the willful refusal of simple fact as opposed to a wonderful ideology started. There's another writer in more recent memory who never quite believed in the ideals, but certainly was the object of odium by the intellectual class, and that's Simon Leys, the wonderful Belgian writer, who has written about Mao's China. Simon Leys was a junior cultural attaché for the Belgian embassy during the Cultural Revolution. He was a graduate of the University of Louvain Catholique, Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium, in Chinese literature, and therefore understood Chinese, and indeed his task was to analyze the communist press for the Belgian government. And he wrote a book about the Cultural Revolution called President Mao's New Clothes, and which denounced comprehensively the horrors that were going on. At the result of which he became the object of a campaign by a clique of pro-Mao intellectuals in Europe, led by various luminaries, Maria Antonietta Macchiecchi in Italy, K.S. Carroll in France, others. And he was hounded all the way to Australia, where he became a professor at the University of Canberra, by these people who accused him of faking what he said, being a reactionary, having to be expelled from the great and the good. I don't think he would have cared about being received in salons in Europe. However, what they did was one of them published a book. The book was called Against Simon Leys, brackets, Pierre-Ric Morse. His real name was Pierre-Ric Morse. His wife was Chinese. Having been denounced publicly because the object of the book was on the cover, it didn't matter whether the book was blank inside, he then could not return to China. His wife could not return to China and meet her family, and that's how they ended up in Australia. That I cannot recommend, read anything by Simon Leys about China or something else, but that shows the amount of vindictiveness and spite and nastiness that left-wing intellectuals will go in order to suppress any kind of talk that is against, that's deviant from the accepted narrative, cozy narrative that communism is wonderful and Maoism is good for the masses.
I just want to thank you for that, which strengthens the point made by Nicholas Parsons a moment ago, which is perhaps this conference, one area which we might cover more, is that of Western complicity in the crimes. And I will say that, each conference should ideally contain the seeds of the next conference. And we will, in fact, I think, want to pick up that idea and run with it. I don't want to cut any further into the time of Professor Service, who is going to respond to the entire conference in a moment or two. So I'm going to ask Mr. Mathé and Mr. Scholten if they would like to make final remarks. Is there anything you want to add to as your final statement? Yeah, sorry.
Oh, the cover has gone. But I'm not sure if we really need it. So the final remarks. I think much has been said here, but one thing is very concrete. Communism is not a noble theory which went wrong through the deeds of Stalin, Uncle Joe, but Lenin wanted to stay on the right side. No. As Stalin has been denounced since the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, we have to denounce Lenin as well, as Lenin has been denounced by the Black Book of Communism. Now the next target is Marx. And afterwards we can go on, as it has been mentioned, to the Great French Revolution. So there is much task to be done.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just like to repeat the words of the Romanian publisher and philosopher Gabriel Liciano, who said about communism, "It creates a society founded on terror that hides behind the mask of a debate about a better society."
Thank you very much. I want to thank all three speakers and ask you if you would to stay in position, because we're not having a break at this point, but you were all extremely self-disciplined, if I may say so, and kept your time limit. And I think as a result, we were all rewarded with a lively discussion from the floor. And so, again, many thanks for what you said, and many thanks for saying it so crisply.